While the world was told a tragic accident claimed Audie Murphy, in the fog of Brush Mountain, newly declassified files suggest a much darker truth. A hero silenced for a final, dangerous mission to expose a government betrayal. What if the most courageous act of this Hollywood legend wasn't on the battlefield, but in the secret documents he was carrying the day his plane fell from the sky? The sharecropper's son and the shuffled deck of fate. The reason the government eventually feared him, and the seeds of the betrayal that would lead to a missing elevator control cable and a redacted Federal Bureau of Investigation memo, started long before 1971. It began in the dust of rural Texas, in a landscape where hope was as scarce as rain, and the soil seemed to take more than it ever gave back to those who tilled it with their bare hands until their fingers were raw, their backs were bent, and their spirits were nearly extinguished by the relentless sun. Long before the medals and the movie cameras, there was a boy born into the desperate, dusty reality of the 1920s. Audie Leon Murphy entered this world in 1925, the seventh of 12 children born to sharecroppers in Hunt County. His childhood was not one of play and laughter, but of grinding, soul-crushing deprivation that many today would find unimaginable. He lived in a world of unpainted shacks and outdoor plumbing, where a pair of shoes was a luxury guarded for years, and a full stomach was a miracle prayed for every night. When his father, Emmett, unable to bear the weight of his failures and the crushing debt of the Great Depression, abandoned the family in 1936, young Audie became the pillar of the household at an age when most boys are still learning their letters. He was forced to witness his mother's health fail under the strain of picking cotton and rearing children in a shack that barely kept out the wind or the snakes that crawled through the floorboards during the cold Texas nights. By the age of 8, he was hunting with a projectile launcher, not for sport, but to ensure his siblings had something to eat, becoming a marksman out of sheer, desperate necessity. The boy who became a giant. He'd learned that a single cartridge cost money, and a missed attempt meant a night of hollow hunger for his brothers and sisters. By 10, he was stooped over in the cotton fields, picking alongside grown men to earn mere pennies that stood between his family and utter starvation. This unyielding moral compass and sense of responsibility for those forgotten by the system would one day make him the most dangerous whistleblower in Washington. He grew up knowing that the only person he could truly rely on was himself, and that those in power often looked right through people like his family as if they were nothing but ghosts in the field. He saw his mother, Josie Bell, toil until her hands bled and her spirit broke, and that memory became a permanent scar on his soul, fueling a lifelong protective instinct for the underdog. He learned that the world did not owe him a living, and that the only way to protect those you loved was to be faster, sharper, and more resilient than the forces trying to beat you down. This childhood was the forge that created the man who could not be bought, and later, the man who could not be allowed to speak his truth to a nation that preferred a sanitized version of its history. He often recalled how hunger felt like a physical weight, a hollow ache that never truly left him, even when he became a wealthy star. He was a boy who understood the value of precision and consequences, a lesson that would define his every move on the battlefield and in the political arena. He carried the ghosts of those hungry Texas nights into every foxhole and every movie set, never forgetting that life was a series of hard choices made under extreme pressure. He would often spend his small earnings on remedies for his mother, sacrificing his own needs to provide a moment of comfort for the woman who had given him everything. What the public later saw as his supernatural calm was actually a survival mechanism forged in the fires of extreme poverty and the cold reality of loss. He never truly had a childhood. He had a series of responsibilities that would have crushed a lesser spirit. When his mother passed away in 1941, 16-year-old Audie was left to hold the remnants of his family together, with nothing but grit and a heavy heart. He was a boy, forced to place his younger siblings in an orphanage to ensure they survived the coming winter, a decision that haunted him long after he had the money to bring them home. He had learned to function on minimal sleep and to suppress every personal desire for the sake of those depending on him. To hell and back, reliving the trauma for the cameras. These were the skills he brought to the military. Not things taught in a manual, but lessons etched into his soul by hunger and hardship. Behind the medals we would all come to admire was a boy who had already lived a lifetime of struggle before he ever put on a uniform. This inherent inability to ignore suffering was exactly what would eventually lead him into the corridors of the Veterans Administration, searching for truths that powerful men wanted to remain buried in the bureaucratic silence of Washington. He was a man who understood that a promise to protect the vulnerable was a sacred oath, not a political talking point. He spent his teenage years working at a radio repair shop and a general store, learning the value of $1 and the weight of a man's word, all while the storm clouds of a global conflict gathered on the horizon. He was a boy who grew old before he ever had the chance to be young, and that premature maturity made him a soldier who looked at danger with a detached, analytical eye rather than the impulsive fervor of youth. He took the pain of his mother's demise and channeled it into a fierce, protective energy that he would soon unleash on the battlefields of the Mediterranean and Europe. To Audie, the war was not about glory. It was another job to do for a family that now included every man in his platoon, and he refused to fail them. His sisters recalled that even as a teenager, he carried the world on his shoulders, never complaining, simply doing what was necessary to survive. This profound sense of duty meant that once he discovered the betrayal within the medical system, he could no more walk away from it than he could have walked away from his starving siblings in 1933. He felt the weight of every individual who passed under his command as if they were his own flesh and blood. Every decision he made in later years, every protest he lodged against the mistreatment of veterans, was rooted in this same desperate need to protect his family, whether it was his siblings in Texas or his brothers in arms in the wards of a VA hospital. When the call to serve came after the events at Pearl Harbor, this undersized Texan felt a calling that transcends his own suffering. He tried to join the Marines, the Navy, and the Army paratroopers, but they all looked at his 5-foot 5-inch frame and 112-pound weight and turned him away with a laugh or a dismissive shake of the head. Recruiters saw a boy they thought was too fragile for the front lines, a baby-faced youth who looked like he belonged in a classroom rather than a muddy foxhole. They saw a runt who would only get in the way of real men. They were wrong. Audie falsified his birth records, desperate to prove his worth and find a place where he truly belonged, and finally convinced the infantry to take him in 1942, just after his 17th birthday. This was the beginning of a transformation that defies belief, a journey that would take a boy who was too small to enlist and turn him into the most decorated combat soldier in the history of the United States. It was here, in the blood and mud of Europe, that he learned he could survive anything, except, perhaps, the treachery of those he fought for. The nightmares under the pillow. He became an expert in the mechanics of war, but he remained a novice in the politics of peace. His initial training at Camp Walters and Fort Meade was a grueling introduction to a world where his size was finally an advantage, allowing him to move through the brush like a phantom, undetected by those who looked only for larger, more obvious threats. He was a ghost in the grass, a shadow in the ruins of North Africa and Italy. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a natural-born tactician who viewed the battlefield as a high-stakes chess match where every move had a fatal consequence. He saw the incompetence of certain officers and the quiet bravery of the common private, forming a worldview that favored the man in the trenches over the man behind the desk, a worldview that would eventually put him on a collision course with the military-industrial complex that sought to use him as a mere prop. During his training, he often outmarched and outshot men twice his size, earning a grudging respect that would soon turn into legendary status. He realized that the medals were often given to those who survived the impossible, but he never forgot the men who did the same work and never came back to receive them. He saw the waste of human existence for poorly planned objectives, and it built in him a deep skepticism of those who gave orders from the safety of the rear, consuming beverages, while 18-year-olds lost their futures for a hill that had no strategic value. This distrust of the men in charge would stay with him long after the ordnance fell silent, eventually informing his investigative work into the VA. Over 3 years and 9 major campaigns, Murphy rose from a humble private to a second lieutenant through sheer, cold-blooded competence. His record reads like a work of fiction, yet every entry is a matter of cold, hard fact, validated by the highest honors his nation could bestow. In Sicily, he dismantled cavalry units. In France, he captured automated projectile stations single-handedly. But it was on January 26, 1945, near Holtz, France, that his legend was truly sealed. The temperature was near zero, the ground was frozen, and his company was being decimated by German armor and infantry. With his company reduced to a mere 19 men, facing an overwhelming German force in the biting cold of the Colmar pocket, Murphy did the unthinkable. He climbed onto a burning, armored vehicle that was on the verge of exploding, and, despite being wounded in the leg, used its heavy defense hardware to hold off an entire company of infantry for an hour. He stood there, atop a box of explosives, alone against the tide of war, screaming coordinates into a field phone, while projectiles rained down around him and the thick black smoke filled his lungs. For this he received the Medal of Honor at just 19 years old. He had become a symbol of American invincibility. Yet the very government pinning that medal to his chest was already noting his refusal to bend to authority or compromise his version of the truth. His actions at Holtz were more than just bravery. They were a display of a man who had reached the absolute limit of what a human being could endure and chose to stand his ground anyway. The inconvenient whistleblower. He was awarded 33 different medals and citations, including the Distinguished Service Cross and 2 Silver Stars, making him a walking monument to the American spirit, even as his soul began to fracture under the weight of the conflict he had witnessed. He saw his best friend, Laddie Tipton, lose his life to a German ruse, an event that fueled a rage and a sorrow that never truly left his eyes, even when he became a star of the silver screen. Witnessing the deception of the enemy in that moment made him hyper-aware of betrayal, a trait that would later allow him to see through the deceptive paperwork of the Veterans Administration decades later. He had earned the Purple Heart 3 times, each scar a reminder that his survival was a miracle that came with a heavy price. The guilt of being the one who lived while better men, in his eyes, were no longer above ground. He once remarked that he felt as though he were living on time, stolen from those who passed. This sense of borrowed time gave him a fearlessness that made him impossible to intimidate by politicians or bureaucrats. When he returned home, his boyish face graced the cover of Life magazine in July 1945, making him an instant national icon and the face of the victory in Europe. He was a hero, a legend, a symbol of American resilience. But as he stepped off the plane into the waiting arms of a grateful nation, a different kind of war was beginning, one that would take place in the quiet, haunted hours of the night and the bright, artificial lights of Hollywood. James Cagney, the great star of the screen, saw that magazine cover and, moved by the haunting intensity in Murphy's eyes, invited him to California. Audie arrived in Hollywood completely out of his element, with no connections or formal education, but he possessed an authenticity and a quiet magnetism that the camera loved. Yet, as he smiled for the publicity stills and attended glittering premieres at the Grauman's Chinese Theater, his hand often stayed close to the defensive sidearm in his pocket, a silent reminder that he was never truly safe, even in the heart of the Dream Factory. The fog-shrouded peak of Brush Mountain. He found the superficiality of the film industry more confusing than the battlefields of Europe. He was a man who had seen the absolute worst of humanity, and the vanity of the movie business felt like a hollow, plastic mockery of the sacrifices his friends had made. He lived in a state of hypervigilance, his ears always tuned to the sounds of the night, even in the most secure mansions of Los Angeles. He was a man out of time, a warrior trying to navigate a world that cared more about lighting and makeup than the heavy, unshakable truths he carried in his chest. In his early days in Hollywood, he often slept in the Cagney stables, preferring the company of horses to the high society parties where he felt like a trophy on display. He found that actors were often more interested in their billing than in the character of the men they portrayed. He was a man searching for a peace that Hollywood's version of glamour simply could not provide. He was constantly surrounded by people who wanted to be near his fame, but very few who wanted to understand the depth of his internal scars or the silent grief he carried for his fallen comrades. He often felt like an outsider, looking in at a world that played at war, while he lived it every single night in his dreams. His stoic nature was often mistaken for arrogance, but it was truly the silence of a man who had seen too much to ever be comfortable in a world of make-believe. He carried a small notebook with him where he wrote of his frustrations, a private record of a hero struggling to breathe in the thin air of celebrity. Over 20 years, he appeared in more than 40 films, becoming a staple of the Western genre, where his natural skill with horses and ordnance could shine with effortless grace. He brought a sense of gritty realism to the screen that was often missing in the 1950s, a quiet intensity that suggested a man who knew exactly what a projectile could do to a body. His greatest achievement on screen was To Hell and Back in 1955, where he performed the harrowing task of playing himself in a dramatization of his own life. Anomalies in the Ash, the evidence of sabotage. Imagine the psychological weight of standing on a soundstage, surrounded by actors in uniforms, recreating the very moments where your comrades were lost, and where you had to take lives to survive. To the audience, it was entertainment. To Audie, it was a waking nightmare of relieved trauma that no amount of money or fame could justify. He was a straight shooter in a town built on illusions, a man of substance in a world of artifice. But even as Universal Studios celebrated their new golden boy and his record-breaking box office numbers, the shadow of his future betrayal was lengthening. The contrast was stark. A public icon of strength and masculinity, privately battling a government that was beginning to find his popularity and his uncompromising integrity highly inconvenient. He refused to be a puppet for the studio or the state, often rejecting scripts that he felt disrespected the reality of the American soldier. He fought with directors over the accuracy of military scenes, refusing to allow the reality of war to be sanitized for the sake of the box office. He was a man who valued truth above all else, a trait that would eventually make him a target of the very establishment that had once used him as a poster boy for patriotism. He even wrote poetry and song lyrics, trying to process the pain through art. But the industry only ever wanted the hero, never the broken, contemplative man behind the mask. He understood that his fame gave him a weapon, and he intended to use it to protect those who had no voice in the halls of power. He was a man who knew that his image belonged to the public, but his soul belonged to the men he had left behind in the mud of France and the dust of Texas. His refusal to play the Hollywood game meant that when he began asking questions about the VA, he had no friends in high places to protect him from the coming storm. COINTELPRO, the surveillance of a patriot. He suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress, though in the 1950s and 60s, there was no name for the darkness that followed him home from the front. He slept with a loaded defensive device under his pillow, his nights haunted by the screams of the battlefield and the faces of those he could not save in the ruins of France. He would wake up in a cold sweat, screaming coordinates for artillery strikes that had happened years ago, his mind trapped in a time loop of violence. He became dependent on prescription sedatives to find even a few hours of peace, and struggled with sudden, intense mood swings that terrified those closest to him and strained his relationships to the breaking point. He once confessed that he lived in a nightmare when he slept, and a daylight version of it when he was awake. He never truly left the forests of France, but unlike others who suffered in silence, Audie was brave enough to speak out when it was social suicide to do so. He advocated for the study of battle fatigue and demanded better treatment for the boys coming home from Korea, who were being ignored by a nation that wanted to forget the cost of war. He was decades ahead of his time, and in doing so, he began to make the powerful institutions of his country very uncomfortable. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a moral force they could not control, and his influence among the veteran community was growing. He would visit VA hospitals unannounced, sitting with the men in the wards and listening to their stories of neglect, despair, and bureaucratic indifference. He saw the systemic failures of the government he had served, and it ignited a fire in him that no studio executive or politician could extinguish. He spoke to congressmen and generals, making himself a nuisance to those who preferred veterans to remain silent, grateful, and out of sight. He even locked himself in a hotel room for a week to break his own addiction to medications, showing the same iron will in his personal battles that he had shown in combat. He was a man who refused to be defeated by his own mind, even as the world around him grew increasingly complicated and hostile to his honesty. His fight for mental health recognition was not just about himself. It was for every soldier who had been told their wounds weren't real because they couldn't be seen on an X-ray. He used his own pain as a bridge to reach those who were drowning in silence. We are losing the true stories of the Golden Age to the fog of time, as the stars who lived them pass into history, and their secrets are buried under layers of Hollywood myth and government redactions. If you believe the truth about our icons deserves to be preserved with dignity, historical accuracy, and profound respect, please consider subscribing to Golden Age Files. By joining us, you help keep the flame of truth burning for heroes like Audie, ensuring their final sacrifices are never buried in a redacted archive or forgotten by a world that moves too fast to look back. Your presence here ensures that these legends continue to speak through the noise of the modern world. We are dedicated to unearthing the stories that have been scrubbed from the history books, providing a voice for those who were silenced by the very institutions they sought to improve. Every new subscriber helps us fund the deep archival research required to bring these hidden truths to light and honor the complex lives of those who built the American dream. We believe that history is a living thing, and your engagement helps us keep it alive for future generations who need to know the true cost of the freedoms they enjoy. We are more than just a channel. We are a community of historians and enthusiasts dedicated to the preservation of the silver screen's darkest and most meaningful chapters. Your support ensures that we can continue to dig through the classified memos and ignored witness statements that the powerful would rather keep hidden. We promise to never look away from the difficult truths of the past. The shadowy pilot and the silent witnesses. By the late 1960s, the Hollywood system was changing, and the straightforward heroism Murphy represented was falling out of fashion in favor of more cynical, anti-hero characters. He faced financial troubles and tax issues that some suggest were exacerbated by his political stances and his refusal to toe the party line. But his primary focus turned toward a new mission: veterans advocacy. He traveled to crumbling hospitals, spoke to those the system had discarded, and began researching a television series that would expose the horrific reality of life after the war for the disabled. It was during this research that Audie stumbled into a hornet's nest of high-level malfeasance. He began uncovering patterns of corruption within the Veterans Administration, specifically the diversion of hospital resources for classified research and unauthorized experimentation on the very men he had fought to protect. He heard whispers in the hospital corridors of behavior modification, sensory deprivation, and psychological conditioning. Secrets that turned his stomach and steeled his resolve to protect his boys one last time. He found evidence of funds being funneled into projects that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with control. And he knew he couldn't let it stand. He was a man who had seen the horrors of the Nazi regime up close, and he recognized the same chilling disregard for human rights creeping into his own country's institutions. He began documenting cases of veterans who entered hospitals with minor issues only to emerge as shells of their former selves, victims of treatments they never consented to, often involving powerful psychiatric substances and experimental therapies that left them broken. He interviewed nurses and doctors who were terrified to speak, but who confirmed that certain wards were off limits to regular staff, operated by men with no discernible medical credentials. He was peeling back the layers of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the Defense Department and the intelligence community. He saw the betrayal of the very men who had bled for the country, and he vowed to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. He spent his own money to hire private investigators to verify the connections he was finding, becoming a one-man intelligence agency against a system that had billions at its disposal. He began keeping a hidden ledger of names, men whose lives had been altered by these experiments, intending to use it as his primary exhibit in a trial that would never happen. By early 1971, Audie was no longer just a fading movie star. He was a liability with a national platform and a reputation for honesty that made him untouchable by ordinary scandals. He had connected the dots between government hospitals, defense contractors, and secret behavior modification programs that would later be linked to projects like MK Ultra. He had names, dates, and locations that could destroy careers and shut down multi-million-dollar covert operations. For a man of his moral authority, staying silent was not an option. He scheduled meetings with investigative journalists from the most influential newspapers in the country, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, ready to present his evidence. He was going to blow the whistle on a betrayal that would have shaken the nation to its core during an era of deep social unrest. The stakes had reached a breaking point. He was prepared to sacrifice his reputation and his safety to protect the soldiers who were being treated as expendable subjects in a Cold War game. But he never made those meetings. He was being followed by men in dark suits. His phones were tapped by agencies that were supposed to protect him, and the walls were closing in on him. He knew the risk he was taking, but he had lived on borrowed time since 1945, and he wasn't about to start being a coward now. He told his close friends that he was onto something huge, something that would change how Americans saw their own government and the price of their security. He had even moved his family to a more secure location, sensing that the pushback from his investigation was becoming physically threatening. He was a man with a target on his back, and he knew exactly who was holding the weapon from the shadows of the deep state. He had prepared a dossier of his findings, a collection of documents that he carried with him at all times, including on that final flight to Virginia. He told a confidant that if anything happened to him, the evidence was in his black bag, a bag that would never be seen again after the impact on Brush Mountain. The final medal, a legacy reclaimed. The flight on May 28, 1971, was supposed to be a routine business trip to discuss a new venture in Martinsville. Despite the thick fog and treacherous peaks of the Virginia Mountains, the pilot, Herman Butler, decided to take off into the soup. This was a man with over 8,000 hours of flight experience, known for his extreme caution and professionalism. Yet, 14 minutes after takeoff, the plane plummeted into Brush Mountain. The official report called it pilot error, but the investigation was remarkably brief, lasting only a fraction of the time usually devoted to high-profile crashes involving national figures, and it ignored the most chilling clues. Key pieces of the wreckage were never found, having seemingly vanished into the woods, despite the extensive search efforts of the local authorities. Witnesses reported hearing an explosion in the air before the plane came down, a sound that was far too sharp and mechanical to be a mere engine stall or impact. One local resident maintained, until his life ended, that there was a distinct boom, followed by several seconds of silence before the final crash, two separate events that suggested the plane was coming apart before it ever touched the trees. The wreckage was scattered over a wide area, inconsistent with a low-speed impact in the fog, suggesting a structural failure that occurred while the aircraft was still thousands of feet in the air, long before the mountain became a factor. The recovery teams noted that the remains were found far from the main fuselage, as if they had been ejected during a mid-air breakup. Yet this detail was omitted from the final National Transportation Safety Board report. The site was secured by unidentified military personnel almost immediately, even before the local police could establish a perimeter, raising questions about how they arrived so quickly in such a remote area. It was as if they were waiting for the plane to fall. The local sheriff was even turned away from certain parts of the debris field, told that federal authorities were in charge of the sensitive materials. Those who arrived first described a scene that looked more like an aerial disintegration than a direct collision with a peak. Modern forensic analysis of the photographs from the site reveals even more disturbing details that point toward a deliberate containment operation executed with professional precision. There is evidence of tampering with the control systems, tool marks that shouldn't be there on the airframe, suggesting the elevator control cables had been deliberately scored with a file. It was the perfect sabotage. The metal was weakened just enough to hold during pre-flight checks and low-altitude maneuvers, but destined to snap under the inevitable stress of mountain turbulence. Furthermore, Herman Butler, the pilot, was revealed to have ties to intelligence services and had flown missions for Air America, the CIA's own private airline, in Southeast Asia. He was not just a private pilot. He was a ghost in the system, a man with a history of covert operations that ended in the ash of a Virginia mountainside, taking a national hero with him to the end. The flight path itself was irregular, as if the pilot were struggling with the controls long before the final plunge. The missing pieces of the tail assembly were never accounted for, and the official records of the plane's maintenance history were found to have significant gaps in the weeks leading up to the fatal flight. It was a textbook controlled flight into terrain, made to look like an accident, but the mechanical evidence whispers of a much darker, much more calculated intervention that required access to the hangar the night before the flight. When independent investigators tried to obtain the original flight recorder data years later, they were told it had been corrupted during storage, a convenient excuse for a system that did not want its secrets analyzed by modern technology. The coincidence of so many failures, mechanical, investigative, and bureaucratic, points to a single, coordinated intent. The disappearance of Murphy's personal briefcase, which witnesses said he carried onto the plane, only adds to the suspicion that the mission was more than just an accident. It was a retrieval of dangerous information. In 2018, a massive declassification of documents revealed that Audie Murphy had been under intense government surveillance for years prior to the crash. He was a priority subject under the Cold War programs designed to monitor and neutralize those deemed a threat to national security or domestic stability. His mail was read, his calls were recorded, his movements were tracked by informants within his own social circles. The government wasn't just watching a war hero. They were monitoring an inconvenient whistleblower who was about to expose their darkest secrets regarding the treatment of veterans and the unethical research being conducted in their names. Every step he took toward the truth brought him closer to the trap they had set. They knew exactly who he was meeting and what he had found. And they knew they couldn't stop a man like Audie Murphy with words or threats alone. The only way to stop the most decorated soldier in history was to make sure he never reached his destination. The files revealed a coordinated effort between the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Central Intelligence Agency to discredit him, using his financial struggles and his personal demons as leverage to keep him silent. But when that failed, and he prepared to go to the press with documented evidence of VA abuse, they turned to more permanent measures. This was not a conspiracy of a few rogue agents, but a systematic operation to protect a massive industry of secrets that involved top-level officials and private contractors. The memos even discussed the optimal timing for his demise to minimize public outcry and ensure the investigation could be contained within a friendly jurisdiction. The sheer scale of the surveillance suggested that Murphy was viewed as a revolutionary threat to the established order. They saw him not as a patriot, but as a leak that needed to be plugged. The memos revealed that his meetings with journalists were viewed as critical failures in containment, leading to the authorization of more extreme measures just days before the crash. The documents show that they feared his moral weight would be enough to bring down entire programs that were deemed vital to the nation's defense. We would love to hear your thoughts on this complex and deeply troubling matter. Which part of this revelation regarding the sabotage and the surveillance surprised you the most? And are there other mysteries from Hollywood's golden age or the lives of military icons you would like us to explore in the future? Please leave a comment below and help us decide our next investigation. Your input drives our search for the truth in a world of redacted files and hidden agendas. Do you believe a man of Murphy's stature could truly be targeted by his own government? Or do you still see it as a tragic accident of fate? Let's start a serious conversation about the history we are never taught in school and the price of standing up for the truth when the stakes are life and the end. Your engagement helps us bypass the algorithms and bring these suppressed stories to a wider audience that deserves to know the truth behind the medals and the movies. We want to know if you think the evidence of the tool marks is the smoking gun, or if the pilot's background is the most damning piece of the puzzle. Every voice in this discussion is a blow against the wall of silence. The legacy of Audie Murphy is one of incredible bravery, not just on the battlefield of World War II, but in the quiet, dangerous rooms where the truth is told. He was a man who survived the greatest war in history, only to lose his life, fighting for the dignity of his fellow soldiers against his own government. His son, Terry Murphy, continues to fight for a formal reinvestigation, navigating a labyrinth of redacted documents, missing evidence, and lost files that always seem to be one step ahead of him. The resistance he faces from the government, even now, over 50 years later, suggests that the secrets Audie found regarding hospital experimentation are still considered dangerous enough to guard against systematic obstruction. It is a story of a hero who was betrayed by the very flag he had defended with his life, a man whose ultimate battle was fought not for territory, but for the soul of his nation. Terry has dedicated his life to clearing his father's name and uncovering the truth of that day on Brush Mountain, facing a wall of silence from agencies that would rather the past remain buried. He seeks not just closure for his family, but justice for every veteran whose rights were violated in those secret wards and whose stories were silenced along with his father's. He has interviewed elderly witnesses who were told to keep quiet for the sake of the country, and he is piecing together a timeline that the official records have tried to erase. He has spent thousands of hours in archives, finding small, overlooked details that contradict the official narrative. He is a man on a mission, fueled by the same tenacity that saw his father survive the Colmar pocket. He knows that the truth is out there, hidden behind a veil of national security, and he won't stop until the fog finally lifts and his father's final mission is completed. He believes that, until the full truth is known, the country hasn't truly honored the man who gave it so much. He works with a small team of volunteer historians, each of them committed to unearthing what the state has tried to bury. Audie Murphy was the orphan who became a king, the soldier who became a star, and the hero who became a victim of the very system he defended. As we look back at his life, we see a man of principle who refused to turn away from a fight, even when the enemy was within his own borders. He once said that he was just a man who was scared and fighting, but in reality, he was a man who stood alone on top of a burning tank to save his friends, and who stood alone against a corrupt system to save his fellow veterans. He may have been silenced on that mountain in 1971, but his voice is finally being heard through the gaps in the official narrative as the secrets of the past slowly come to light through declassified papers. He was a man who understood that freedom isn't just about winning a war. It's about what you do with the peace that follows and how you treat those who made that peace possible. He was a beacon of integrity in a world of compromise, and his story remains a powerful reminder of the cost of standing up for what is right, even when the price is everything you have. His face, frozen in his youthful prime on the silver screen, masks a wisdom and a sadness that only those who have seen the absolute truth of human nature can truly understand. He was a man who walked through the valley of the shadow of the end and emerged with a commitment to the living that eventually led to his own sacrifice. He was the ultimate patriot, the man who loved his country enough to tell it the hard truths it didn't want to hear. He proved that the greatest service one can provide to a democracy is to hold it accountable to its own ideals, no matter how many medals they pin to your chest. He was the guardian of the American conscience, a role he played until his very last breath. If you found this exploration of Audie Murphy's final mission and the shadow of Brush Mountain meaningful, please like and share this video with those who appreciate the true, unvarnished history of our great stars and heroes. Your support is vital as we continue to tell the stories that the studios and the systems tried to bury in the shadows of the past. By sharing, you ensure that the truth cannot be hidden forever, and that the sacrifices of men like Audie Murphy are not in vain. We are committed to bringing you the most thoroughly researched and emotionally resonant stories from the Golden Age, and your engagement makes that possible in an age of digital noise and sanitized history. Every share is a strike against the redaction of our collective memory and a vote for historical transparency. Your participation helps us grow our community of truth seekers and ensures that the legends of the past are never forgotten by those who follow in their footsteps. We want to build a legacy of truth, and we can only do it with your help. Every click helps us push back against the darkness of ignorance. We thank you for joining us as we honor the complicated humanity and the ultimate sacrifice of Audie Murphy. His films will always remind us of the boyish hero we fell in love with, but the truth of his final days reminds us of the courageous man he became. A man who died for his brothers in arms just as surely as if he had been on the front lines in 1944. He was a man who never stopped being a soldier, a man who fought until the very end for the people he loved and the principles he believed in. He proved that true heroism is not just about medals, but about the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal consequences. He remains an inspiration for every person who believes that one voice can change the world if it is loud enough and honest enough. Until next time, we invite you to keep the memory of the Golden Age alive by seeking the truth behind the glamour and the history beneath the headlines. If you felt the weight of Audie Murphy's final mission today, please consider joining our community of history keepers by hitting the like button and subscribing to Golden Age Files. We are dedicated to ensuring these complex, deeply human legacies are never lost to the fog of time. Which part of Audie's discovery on Brush Mountain surprised you the most? And which star of the silver screen should we investigate next? Please leave your thoughts and topic requests in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you for spending this time in the past with us. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay informed, and always look for the truth behind the image.